In Kensington, a city of bustling streets and tight-knit neighborhoods, crime was often a distant worry. Yet, the peace shattered when a series of burglaries struck the wealthiest homes. Jewelry worth millions, heirlooms passed down generations, and safes emptied without a trace. It was as if the culprits moved like shadows, unseen and unstoppable. Fear gripped the residents, turning their lives into a routine of locked doors and restless nights. The police, under immense pressure from the public and local officials, scrambled to find a suspect. Enter Anthony Tony Carter, a handyman with a troubled past, known for doing odd jobs around town. Tony's name came up when stolen items, later confirmed to be from one of the burglaries, were discovered in a locker rented under his name. Further investigation revealed his fingerprints on a window at one of the crime scenes. For the authorities, it seemed like the break they desperately needed. Tony's arrest was swift, and the media was quick to capitalize on the story. Headlines declared him guilty before he even stepped into a courtroom. "Kensington burglar caught red-handed," screamed one local tabloid. National outlets picked up the story, painting Tony as a dangerous criminal. Social media buzzed with speculation, many expressing relief that justice was served. Amid the frenzy, one figure stood apart: Judge Emily Hargrove. Assigned to preside over the trial, she was known for her unyielding commitment to fairness. At 53, she had built a reputation as one of the most respected judges in the state. Her courtroom was her domain, and her rulings carried the weight of meticulous consideration. Yet, as the trial approached, Emily felt an unease she couldn't shake. The case against Tony was strong, at least on the surface. The prosecution had assembled a wealth of evidence: fingerprints, stolen goods, and eyewitness testimony. Money. But Emily knew the law demanded more than a convincing narrative. It required proof beyond a reasonable doubt. As she pored over the case files late into the night, she found herself questioning the very foundation of the prosecution's argument. The trial became a media circus before it even began. News trucks lined the streets outside the courthouse, their satellite dishes pointed skyward. Reporters jostled for interviews with anyone remotely connected to the case, from Tony's former neighbors to the officer who arrested him. In the court of public opinion, Tony was already convicted. Emily had always maintained a strict separation between her personal and professional life, but the media coverage invaded her sanctuary. Friends and acquaintances would casually mention the case, offering unsolicited opinions. "It's open and shut," one colleague remarked over coffee. That guy is guilty as sin, but Emily knew better than to let public sentiment influence her judgment. Her job was to ensure a fair trial, no matter the outcry. Still, the noise was hard to ignore. It wasn't just Tony on trial, it was the integrity of the judicial system itself. Anthony Carter's life had been anything but easy. Born into poverty, he spent his early years scraping by in a rough neighborhood. His criminal record was littered with minor offenses: shoplifting as a teenager, a stint for trespassing, but nothing that marked him as a hardened criminal. Yet his past was enough to paint him as a convenient scapegoat. When Tony was arrested, he claimed innocence from the start. "I didn't do it," he told the arresting officers. "Someone's setting me up." His protests fell on deaf ears, overshadowed by the damning evidence against him. Tony's demeanor in court was stoic, but there was a vulnerability in his eyes that Judge Hargrove couldn't ignore. He maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings, refusees, plea deals that would have reduced his sentence but required an admission of guilt. To many, his refusal only cemented his guilt, a desperate man clinging to denial. The prosecution presented their case with confidence, almost arrogance. They began with the fingerprints found on the window of a mansion burglarized 6 months earlier. Forensic experts testified that the prints were a match for Tony's. Then came the stolen goods, discovered in a locker rented under his name. Surveillance footage from a nearby storage facility showed Tony entering the building on the same day the locker was rented. The pièce de résistance was an eyewitness. Stephen Hale, a local security guard, who claimed he had seen Tony near the scene of one of the burglaries on the night it occurred. Hale's testimony was delivered with precision, painting a vivid picture of Tony skulking in the shadows. It was a textbook case. Too textbook, Emily thought. The evidence fit together too neatly, like pieces of a puzzle snapped into place. Where was the chaos, the inconsistency, the messiness of real life. Tony's defense team, led by Claire Donovan, faced an uphill battle. Claire was fresh out of law school, and this was her first major case. The media dubbed her the Rookie, a nickname that did little to inspire confidence. Her initial strategy was to attack the reliability of the prosecution's evidence, but her arguments lacked the polish and conviction to sway the jury. Tony's financial situation also limited the defense's resources. While the prosecution had access to top-notch forensic experts and seasoned investigators, Claire had to make do with what she could afford. Every objection she raised was met with swift rebuttals from the prosecution. Yet, Claire had something the prosecution lacked: a growing suspicion that Tony was innocent. Her instincts told her there was more to the case than met the eye. And then, she found it, the first crack in the prosecution's armor. Stephen Hale, the star witness, faltered under cross-examination. Claire questioned him about T. The night he supposedly saw Tony near the crime scene. "Are you absolutely certain it was him?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. Hale hesitated, glancing nervously at the prosecutor before answering. "I think so," he said. "But you didn't report it immediately," Claire pressed. "In fact, you only came forward after being offered leniency in an unrelated matter. Isn't that correct?" Hale's face turned crimson as he admitted that his testimony had been encouraged by promises of a lighter sentence for his own legal troubles. The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Hale's recantation planted seeds of doubt in the jury's minds. If one piece of the prosecution's case was shaky, what else might be unreliable? It was during this period of uncertainty that Claire introduced a name that sent shockwaves through the trial: Vincent Marlowe. A shadowy figure known for orchestrating high-stakes crimes, Marlowe's name was whispered in criminal circles, but rarely spoken aloud. Claire presented correspondence discovered by Tony's sister, Rachel, suggesting that Marlowe had been involved in the Kensington burglaries. The letters were cryptic, full of vague references to cleaning up loose ends, but they hinted at a conspiracy that went far beyond Tony. The revelation of Vincent Marlowe's potential involvement changed the narrative. The media, once convinced of Tony's guilt, now latched onto the possibility of a larger conspiracy. Public opinion began to shift, and even the jury seemed to regard Tony with less hostility. For Judge Hargrove, the case had become a test of her moral compass. She knew she couldn't allow speculation to dictate the outcome, but the growing inconsistencies in the prosecution's case were impossible to ignore. As the trial continued, Emily found herself at a crossroads. Would she follow her instincts, even if it meant risking her reputation? Or would she let the evidence, Lord as it was, dictate the verdict? The courtroom had always been Judge Emily Hargrove's domain, a place where fairness reigned supreme, and the law was an unwavering constant. Over the years, she had built a reputation for being meticulous, impartial, and unshakably committed to justice. Yet, as the trial of Anthony Tony Carter unfolded, Emily found herself grappling with doubts she could neither ignore nor dismiss. For the first time in her career, the lines between her instincts and her duty seemed to blur, leaving her in a moral quandary. Tony's case was unlike anything Emily had encountered before. The evidence against him seemed overwhelming. His fingerprints had been found on the window of one of the burgled homes. Stolen items were discovered in a locker rented in his name, and a witness had placed him near the scene of one of the crimes. On the surface, the case appeared airtight, yet something gnawed at Emily. It wasn't one glaring inconsistency, but a series of subtle details that didn't quite add up. The timing of Tony's arrest was one of those details. The Kensington burglaries had gone on for months, each heist more audacious than the last. The pressure on law enforcement to produce results was immense, and when Tony was arrested, it felt almost too convenient. Emily had seen how public and political pressure could influence the justice system, even if only in subtle ways. It wasn't unheard of for cases to be rushed, evidence framed in the best possible light to secure a conviction. As she pored over the case files in her study late into the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that Tony might be a scapegoat. The evidence was strong, yes, but it was also a little too neat, a little too perfect, as though it had been designed to withstand scrutiny rather than discovered organically. Adding to her unease was the demeanor of the defendant himself. Tony Carter was no stranger to trouble. His recce, while not spotless, was hardly the profile of a career criminal. He had a history of petty thefts and minor offences, but nothing that suggested the cunning and sophistication required to pull off the Kensington burglaries. In court, Tony was quiet and stoic, his face a mask of defiance and resignation. Yet there was something in his eyes and earnestness that Emily found hard to ignore. He maintained his innocence with a quiet conviction, refusing to accept plea deals that would have reduced his sentence but required him to admit guilt. To many, his refusal was seen as stubbornness, the last act of a desperate man. To Emily, it suggested something deeper. Outside the courtroom, the case had become a media spectacle. News trucks lined the streets, and reporters eagerly dissected every development. In the court of public opinion, Tony had already been convicted. Justice for Kensington had become the rallying cry of a city desperate for closure. Emily avoided the news as much as she could, but the weight of public expectation was impossible to escape. Friends and colleagues, usually careful not to discuss ongoing cases, would occasionally let their opinions slip. "This one's straightforward," one fellow judge had remarked casually. "You've got an open and shut case." The comment, though innocuous, only heightened Emily's unease. The weight of expectation wasn't just on her shoulders, it loomed over the entire trial. The turning point came during the cross-examination of Stephen Hale, the prosecution's star witness. Hale had claimed to see Tony near one of the crime scenes on the night of a burglary, a detail that bolstered the prosecution's narrative. Under questioning, however, Hale faltered. The defense attorney, a young and relatively inexperienced lawyer named Claire Donovan, pressed him on the circumstances of his testimony. Was he absolutely certain it was Tony he had seen? Had he reported the sighting immediately, or had it come later, after encouragement from the police? Hale's responses were hesitant, his confidence wavering. Finally, he admitted that his testimony had been influenced by promises of leniency in an unrelated matter. The revelation sent ripples through the courtroom, and for the first time, the prosecution's case began to show cracks. Then there was Rachel Carter, Tony's younger sister. When she took the stand, the courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on her as she fought to maintain her composure. Rachel presented new evidence correspondence that suggested the involvement of a shadowy figure named Vincent Marlowe, a man rumoured to orchestrate high-profile crimes and frame others to cover his tracks. The letters were cryptic, filled with veiled references to loose ends and clean-ups, but they pointed to a possibility that couldn't be ignored. Rachel's testimony was emotional but measured, her plea for her brother's innocence striking a chord even with those who had been skeptical. Emily watched the scene unfold with a growing sense of unease. Rachel's evidence wasn't definitive, but it raised enough questions to challenge the prosecution's narrative. If Marlowe was involved, as the letters suggested, then Tony might very well be an innocent man caught in a web of deceit. Yet, as a judge, Emily knew she couldn't act on speculation. Her role was to evaluate the evidence presented, not to conduct her own investigation. Still, the cracks in the prosecution's case were becoming harder to ignore. Late at night, as she sat alone in her study, Emily wrestled with the weight of her responsibility. The law demanded impartiality, but it also demanded justice. How could she reconcile the two when the evidence seemed both compelling and flawed? Her father's words echoed in her mind. The law is blind, but it is not deaf to the truth. She had always interpreted this as a call to fairness, but now it felt like a challenge. Could she truly claim to serve justice if she ignored her instincts? Seeking clarity, Emily reached out to her mentor, retired Judge William Kent. Over the years, Kent had been a steady source of wisdom, someone Emily turned to in moments of doubt. Over a late-night phone call, she laid out her concerns, her voice heavy with frustration. "I can't let my feelings guide me, can I?" she asked. Kent was silent for a moment before replying. "Impartiality doesn't mean ignoring your instincts, Emily. It means using them to ask the right questions. If something feels wrong, it's your duty to find out why." The conversation left her with a renewed sense of purpose. Emily resolved to approach the case with fresh eyes, to scrutinize every piece of evidence, and ensure that no detail was overlooked. Her role wasn't to find the truth, but to create the conditions in which it could emerge. As the trial moved toward its conclusion, Emily knew that her decision would not only determine Tony Carter's fate, but also test the very principles she had built her career on. She couldn't let her doubts dictate the verdict, but neither could she ignore them. The law might be blind, but she wasn't. And sometimes, justice required looking beyond the surface to see the bigger picture. For Emily, the case had become more than a legal challenge. It was a test of her humanity, her ethics, and her belief in the system she had devoted her life to. The prosecution wasted no time establishing their case against Anthony Tony Carter. From the moment they began their opening arguments, their confidence was palpable, their strategy meticulously crafted to leave no room for doubt. Leading the prosecution was Assistant District Attorney Margaret Lennox, a seasoned lawyer known for her precision and tenacity. With a reputation for securing convictions in high-profile cases, Lennox approached Tony's trial with the same fervor and determination she had become famous for. The jury watched intently as Lennox rose to her feet, her every word measured, her every gesture purposeful. She began with a chilling recount of the Kensington burglaries, describing in vivid detail the fear that had gripped the community. This was not just theft, Lennox declared, her voice resonating with authority. This was a calculated series of crimes that shattered the peace and security of an entire neighborhood. The statement set the tone for what was to follow, a barrage of evidence that, if accepted at face value, would firmly place Tony at the center of the crimes. Lennox's first piece of evidence was physical, fingerprints lifted from a window at the scene of one of the burglaries. A forensic expert took the stand to explain how the prints were identified and matched to Tony. The expert's testimony was detailed and technical, leaving little room for doubt. "These prints are a definitive match," the expert concluded, pointing to charts and magnified images displayed on a large screen. The jurors nodded along, their skepticism visibly eroding with each slide. Next came the stolen goods. The prosecution introduced photographs of jewelry, watches, and other valuables recovered from a storage locker rented under Tony's name. Each item was meticulously catalogued, its connection to the burglarized homes verified through police reports and victim testimonies. The evidence felt undeniable. A detective took the stand to detail the discovery, describing how Tony had been identified as the locker's owner through rental records and surveillance footage. The footage, grainy but clear enough to recognize Tony's features, was played for the court. The image of him entering the storage facility on the day the locker was rented was damning, and the room seemed to shift as the jury absorbed its implications. But Lennox wasn't finished. Her most compelling weapon was an eyewitness, Stephen Hale, a security guard who claimed to have seen Tony near the scene of one of the burglaries on the night it occurred. Hale was a composed and confident witness, recounting the events of that night with precision. "I was doing my rounds when I saw him," Hale testified, pointing to Tony at the defense table. "He was standing near the hedge, watching the house. I remember because it struck me as unusual he didn't belong there." Lennox leaned into Hale's testimony, emphasizing its importance. "Mr. Hale is a trained observer," she reminded the jury. "He has years of experience identifying suspicious activity. His sighting of the defendant is not a coincidence. It is a critical piece of evidence that connects Mr. Carter to the crime." Hale's words painted a picture of Tony as a man caught in the act, and the jury seemed to take them at face value. As the prosecution presented its case, it became clear that they had anticipated every possible challenge from the defense. Each piece of evidence was layered, supported by multiple sources, and delivered with an air of absolute certainty. Lennox was methodical, ensuring that every element of the case reinforced the others. The fingerprints linked Tony to the crime scene, the stolen goods tied him to the burglaries, and the eyewitness testimony placed him at the scene. It was a seamless narrative, designed to lead the jury to an inescapable conclusion. Tony Carter was guilty. The prosecution's confidence was not limited to their presentation of evidence. It extended to their demeanor. Lennox's tone was calm but firm, her arguments delivered with the precision of a surgeon. She anticipated potential weaknesses in the case and addressed them preemptively. When the defense raised questions about the reliability of the fingerprints, Lennox countered with additional expert testimony. When doubts about the storage locker's ownership were suggested, she produced signed rental agreements bearing Tony's name. Every question was met with an answer, every challenge with a rebuttal. The jury appeared captivated. Their focus rarely wavered as they listened to the prosecution's witnesses, examined the evidence, and watched the carefully prepared visuals. Even the judge, Emily Hargrove, couldn't help but acknowledge the strength of the prosecution's case. Yet, beneath her calm exterior, Hargrove felt a growing unease. The case was almost too perfect, the evidence too cohesive. She had seen enough trials to know that real life was rarely this tidy. As the prosecution rested its case, the courtroom was left in stunned silence. Lennox's closing statement was a masterstroke of persuasion. She recapped the evidence, tying every thread together into a narrative that left little room for doubt. "This is not a case of circumstantial evidence," she declared. "This is a case of clear, undeniable proof. Anthony Carter committed these crimes, and justice demands that he be held accountable." To the casual observer, the trial seemed all but decided. The prosecution's confidence was infectious, spreading through the courtroom like wildfire. Yet, for those willing to look closer, those like Judge Hargrove, the cracks in the foundation of their argument were becoming harder to ignore. The evidence was compelling, but was it truthful? The witnesses were convincing, but were they reliable? The prosecution's case was strong, but was it just? As the jury deliberated on the evidence presented, the weight of the trial shifted. Questions lingered, doubts began to form, and the story of Tony Carter took on a complexity that no amount of confidence could erase. Stephen Hale had been the linchpin of the prosecution's case. A seasoned security guard with years of experience patrolling Kensington's affluent neighborhoods, his testimony painted Tony Carter as a shadowy figure lurking near the scene of one of the burglaries. Hale's initial statement was delivered with poise and conviction, his calm demeanor giving the impression of an unimpeachable witness. To the jury, he seemed credible. His description of Tony as watching the house with intent felt like the missing puzzle piece that tied the case together. But when it came time for the defense to cross-examine him, Claire Donovan, the young but determined defense attorney, had other plans. The courtroom fell into a tense hush as she stood, her thin file of notes in one hand, her expression calm but calculating. While the prosecution had relied on Hale's unshakable authority, Donovan saw something else, cracks in his certainty that she was ready to exploit. "Mr. Hale," Donovan began, her voice steady but probing. "You've worked as a security guard for, 15 years now?" "That's correct," Hale replied, straightening in his seat. He seemed almost proud to affirm his credentials. "An impressive career," Donovan acknowledged, pacing slowly before the jury. "You've seen a lot of things, he'd imagine. How often have you testified in cases like this?" Hale hesitated, the question catching him off guard. "A few times," he said cautiously. "A few times. And in those cases, would you say your observations were critical to the outcome?" "Sometimes they were," Hale admitted, his composure intact. Van nodded as though agreeing. "You're used to being relied upon then. People trust your observations, don't they?" Hale shifted slightly. "I suppose they do." Donovan paused, allowing the silence to build. Then she turned to face him directly, her voice soft but sharp. "Let's talk about the night you claim to have seen Mr. Carter. You testified that you saw him standing near a hedge, watching the house in question. Is that correct?" "Yes, that's correct," Hale affirmed, his confidence returning. "You also testified that you recognized him as Anthony Carter that night. I'd like to ask, how far away were you when you saw him?" Hale blinked, the question clearly unexpected. "About 30, maybe 40 feet, he said, his tone less certain. 30 or 40 feet, Donovan repeated, her tone neutral. "And it was dark, wasn't it?" "Yes, but the streetlights were on," Hale quickly added. Donovan raised an eyebrow. "Streetlights. Did you get a clear view of his face, Mr. Hale? Or was it more of an impression based on his posture, his build, and perhaps assumptions?" The prosecution objected, accusing Donovan of badgering the witness. Judge Hargrove sustained the objection but allowed Donovan to rephrase. She didn't miss a beat. "Let me rephrase, Mr. Hale," Donovan said, her voice firm but polite. "You were certain it was Mr. Carter, but you only identified him weeks later. correct? Not on the night in question? Hale hesitated. That's true, he admitted, glancing at the prosecution's table. Lennox gave him a tight nod, urging him to stay calm. Donovan seized the moment. And you made this identification after speaking with the police, who showed you photographs of Mr. Carter. Isn't that correct? Yes, but I recognized him from that night, Hale said defensively. From a photograph provided by the police, Donovan clarified, her tone now more aggressive. Mr. Hale, do you remember what you told the officers during your initial interview? I have the transcript right here. She lifted a document from her desk, her eyes scanning the text. Hale swallowed visibly. Don't remember everything I said. That's all right, Donovan said, feigning understanding. I'll remind you. When asked if you could identify the person you saw, your response was, and I quote, not really. It was dark, and I didn't get a good look. Is that an accurate statement of what you said? The courtroom held its breath. Hale looked to Lennox for reassurance, but none came. I may have said that, he muttered, his voice barely audible. Donovan leaned forward, her voice cutting through the silence. So, at the time, you couldn't be certain it was Mr. Carter. Yet here you are, months later, confidently testifying that it was him. What changed, Mr. Hale? Two remembered more details later, Hale stammered, his previously steady demeanor unraveling. You remembered more after being shown Mr. Carter's photograph by the police, Donovan pressed. And after you were promised leniency in an unrelated matter. Isn't that true, Mr. Hale? The prosecution leapt to their feet, objecting vehemently. Judge Hargrove allowed the objection, reminding Donovan to tread carefully, but the damage was done. The jury was visibly stirred, their earlier confidence in Hale's testimony now visibly shaken. Donovan didn't push further, but closed with a simple, damning question. Mr. Hale, can you state under oath, with absolute certainty, that the man you saw that night was Anthony Carter? Knowing what you've just admitted, can you truly say you're certain? Hale hesitated, his face pale. I can't be completely certain, he finally admitted, his voice barely a whisper. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. The once impeccable witness, the cornerstone of the prosecution's case, had crumbled under pressure. The jurors exchanged glances, the seeds of doubt now firmly planted. The prosecution attempted to recover, later calling Hale back for redirect examination, but his credibility had been irreparably damaged. His initial confidence had turned into doubt, and his testimony now carried the taint of manipulation. For Judge Hargrove, the recantation was a turning point. She had felt uneasy about the case from the start, but this moment underscored the fragility of the evidence against Tony. Hale's admission cast a shadow over the entire prosecution narrative, forcing everyone in the courtroom to re-evaluate what they thought they knew about the case. The trial moved on, but the echoes of Hale's recantation lingered. What had once seemed like a straightforward case was now mired in uncertainty, and Tony Carter's guilt was no longer the foregone conclusion it had appeared to be. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that only comes when every word feels like it could change everything. Rachel Carter, her voice raw but unwavering, had just stepped down from the witness stand. The faint rustle of papers and the shifting of chairs were the only sounds that followed, as though the weight of her testimony had sucked the air from the room. Judge Emily Hargrove sat at the bench, her gavel resting unused, her mind churning as the enormity of the moment sank in. The name Vincent Marlowe lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. What had once seemed like a straightforward casier man caught by fingerprints and circumstance had transformed into a labyrinth of doubt and intrigue. Marlowe, the elusive ghost in the world of high-stakes crime, was suddenly more than a whispered rumor. If Rachel's evidence was real, if her brother Tony Carter had been framed, then Marlowe wasn't just a shadow anymore, he was the puppet master pulling the strings. But that wasn't enough to save Tony. Not yet. Lennox, the prosecution's ironclad strategist, wasn't ready to let the narrative slip from her grasp. Rising with measured composure, she addressed the court, her voice slicing through the tension like a knife. Your Honor, while the defense's attempt to introduce Mr. Marlowe into this case is creative, it's ultimately irrelevant. There is no direct link between this so-called evidence and the Kensington burglaries. Let's not lose sight of the fact that the defendant's fingerprints were found at the scene. The jury must remember that the evidence against Mr. Carter is undeniable. Claire Donovan, her nerves steeled by Rachel's testimony, didn't wait for permission to reply. "No link," she echoed, her tone incredulous. "Receipts tied to the same storage facility where stolen goods were planted in my client's locker. Letters outlining a plan to frame someone as a patsy. If this isn't a link, Your Honor, I don't know what is." The courtroom buzzed with whispers, forcing Judge Hargrove to tap her gavel lightly. "Order in the court," she commanded, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. Even she couldn't deny the growing cracks in the prosecution's case. "Miss Donovan," the judge said, fixing the defense attorney with a steady gaze. "If you wish to pursue this line of argument, you'll need more than letters and receipts. The jury cannot convict or acquit based on speculation. Do you have anything else to support your claims?" Claire hesitated. "Not yet, Your Honor. But if the court grants us additional time, I believe we can authenticate." "That's enough," Lennox interrupted, her voice rising slightly for the first time. "This is a stalling tactic. They're grasping at straws to distract the jury from the hard evidence that proves the defendant's guilt." Judge Hargrove raised a hand, silencing both attorneys. Her eyes scanned the courtroom, lingering on Tony Carter, whose face remained impassive, his fingers gripping the edge of the defense tee. Able. Then they flicked to Rachel, who sat with her head high, though the tremor in her clasped hands betrayed her anxiety. Finally, the judge addressed the jury. "You have heard compelling arguments from both sides," she began, her voice measured but firm. "However, the law requires us to focus on the evidence presented, not the theories proposed. As we proceed, I urge you to weigh everything carefully. This case is far from over." With that, the trial adjourned for the day, but the courtroom's energy didn't dissipate. Reporters outside clamored for interviews, their cameras flashing as Claire, Rachel, and Tony exited the building under the watchful eye of court security. Lennox brushed past them without a word, her tight-lipped expression betraying her irritation. Inside her chambers, Judge Hargrove sat alone, the stack of case files before her untouched. Her instincts told her that Rachel's testimony had unearthed something profound, something that couldn't be ignored. But the weight of her role loomed large. A judge's duty was to maintain order and impartiality, yet here she was, feeling as though she stood on the edge of a precipice. One misstep, and the entire case could spiral out of control. That night, sleep eluded her. She replayed Rachel's words, the contents of the letters, the receipts linking Marlowe to the storage facility. She thought of Stephen Hale's recantation, the cracks in his testimony that had set the wheels of doubt in motion. And she thought of Tony, the quiet man sitting at the defense table, who had refused to plead guilty to crimes he insisted he hadn't committed. As the clock ticked past midnight, a question gnawed at her. Was she presiding over a trial, or a carefully orchestrated lie? The next morning, as the court reconvened, the atmosphere was taut with tension. Judge Hargrove entered the courtroom with her usual poise, but her sharp gaze betrayed her growing unease. The jury filed in, their expressions guarded, their thoughts unreadable. Tony sat at the defense table, his face drawn but resolute. Rachel was in her usual seat, clutching a notepad as though it were a lifeline. And then there was Claire, her movements purposeful, her eyes scanning the room as if daring the prosecution to strike first. Lennox, ever the tactician, wasted no time reclaiming the narrative. She called a forensic expert to the stand, bolstering the reliability of the fingerprint evidence and the surveillance footage that tied Tony to the storage locker. Her strategy was clear: drown the jury in hard facts, overwhelm them with the weight of irrefutable science. But even as the prosecution built its case brick by brick, the foundation felt shaky. The defense's revelations had planted seeds of doubt, and no amount of forensic testimony could completely erase them. As the day wore on, the tension reached a boiling point. Near the end of the session, Claire rose with an unexpected request. "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but charged with emotion, "I move for a subpoena of Vincent Marlowe's known associates and financial records. If he is indeed the mastermind behind these crimes, his network may hold the answers we're looking for." The courtroom erupted into murmurs. Lennox immediately objected, calling the motion a fishing expedition designed to derail the trial. But Claire held her ground, her conviction evident in every word. "This isn't a distraction, Your Honor. It's the pursuit of the truth. If we fail to explore this lead, we risk convicting an innocent man while the real criminal walks free." Judge Hargrove's gavel came down hard, silencing the courtroom. She leaned forward, her expression unreadable as she addressed Claire. "Ms. Donovan, you're asking this court to expand the scope of the trial significantly. We'll take your request under advisement, but understand this. Speculation will not win your case. If you wish to pursue this, you'll need to bring more than theories to light." Oh, the table. As court adjourned for the day, the air buzzed with uncertainty. Outside, the media frenzy intensified, reporters speculating about what would come next. Inside the courthouse, tension lingered like a storm cloud, heavy and foreboding. Judge Hargrove retreated to her chambers, the weight of the case pressing down on her more than ever. The letters, the fingerprints, the shifting testimonies, it all pointed to a case far more complex than anyone had anticipated. She stared at the files before her, knowing that the next steps would either expose the truth or bury it forever. The trial had begun as a search for justice. Now, it felt like a race against time, with the stakes higher than anyone could have imagined. The name Vincent Marlowe loomed over everything, a shadowy figure whose presence threatened to upend not only the case, but the very principles the court stood for. As the lights in the courthouse dimmed and the city outside settled into the quiet hum of night, one question hung in the air, unanswered but undeniable. What happens when justice itself is put on trial?